Staying in contact. I'm London Mitchell. Fake news is a term that has come to mean different things to different people. For the sake of this program, let's define fake news as those news stories that are false. The story itself is fabricated with no verifiable facts, sources, or quotes. Sometimes these stories may be propaganda that is intentionally designed to mislead us. Fake news stories have proliferated via social media, in part because they are so easily and quickly shared online. And that's the essence of our broadcast this week. My guest is Associate Professor Rick Busselle in the Bowling Green State University School of Media and Communication. His research and teaching focuses on how mediated stories influence our perceptions of social issues and social problems, such as poverty and crime. So, is the growth in fake news because maybe we want to hear what we want to hear?
I mean, we've known for decades, if not longer, that people seek information that agrees with what they already think or what they want to believe. I mean, that's human nature. Years ago, a colleague of mine said, the human brain is a defense mechanism. It looks for ways to confirm what it already thinks. And that's a pretty dangerous phenomenon. That tendency to seek information that confirms what we already believe has always been a dangerous phenomenon, but it's become more so given the ease with which we can find information that is often inaccurate or false, but it feels good to us. And so we seek it out. And then the reality is, once we seek it out, if it agrees with us, then we tend to remember it and we tend to repeat it without much faith in whether it's true or not.
And that is so much easier today to repeat that fake news than it's ever been.
Yeah, that's one of the problems is social media makes it's so easy to repost or repeat information that's just not accurate. And you know, I teach a history class that I really enjoy, and one of the things that troubles me in thinking back about history and where we are today is that for a long time, what we now call the legacy media, but the big networks, the big newspapers, the big radio news operations, when you go back to, you know, the days of Murrow and whatnot. I mean, all of the news that we got about the big events of history, those news organizations were certainly biased in ways. I mean, they tended to be biased toward a white perspective. They tended to be biased toward a male perspective, and they tended to be biased toward a corporate perspective. But their main concern was to not lose credibility. And so it was quite rare and we can count the instances on a couple of hands. It was quite rare for the New York Times to make a mistake, or the Washington Post to make a mistake, or CBS News to make a mistake. And they certainly didn't just make up information and distribute it, because they were concerned that if they lost their credibility with the audience, they would lose audience. And so there was a lot of gatekeeping, and there was a lot of caution and a lot of good editorial behavior, even though there were certainly biases. But that's gone. Right now, there are so many outlets and so many voices that really many of them don't have much interest in credibility. They don't have much, if they're wrong, they don't care. It doesn't really matter. And so the old days, right, where we had relatively few big news sources, there were problems with that. But I think those problems were nothing like the problems we have today with social media, where there's just no accountability.
That is a real concern, is the accountability. Is that something we can ever get back to? Or is this just something we're going to have to accept, that there is no longer a bias that may not be deliberate? And I guess I go back to the as you point, the days of Murrow and the earlier days of big network operations, they did have a bias. As you said, it was probably white, probably to more of a male audience, but I don't think those biases necessarily were intended in the reporting. It was just more or less a reflection of our society. But today, if I hear you correctly, we've got intended biases.
Yeah, and that's absolutely. I mean, absolutely. And there were mechanisms built into the news system that did check those biases, right? I mean, there were, did you only talk to one people on one side of the story? Did you check that fact? There were things um, that would prevent the worst behavior from really even being considered. To be honest with you, I mean, I worked in news in the '80s in Toledo, and I mean, the things that we see today, we would never even have considered doing. Now, having said that, I think that most of the mainstream news organizations are still doing good journalism, good fact checking. I don't think that the news operations on either side of the political spectrum, I don't think those news operations are doing. Really, I think they're doing as good a work as they ever have. The problem is that some of the news operations have built these opinion mills on the side. And that's where an awful lot of the problems arise. And then that opinion mill kind of, I don't know what you want to call that opinion mill engine, it draws in people who are more willing to say things that aren't true. And it draws in people who are more willing to say things that are clearly pandering to one political side or the other. But I'll be honest with you, I will look at the CNN website and the Fox News website, and I look at just the news stories, and they're really not very different. They report the facts, and really they're reporting the facts that are in the. I mean, gosh, it's hard to find error. But what happens then is that both of those news sources, or those sources of news reporting, then they get picked up by the opinion mill of that very network, and then all of the other networks that sort of use that news, or all the other outlets that use that news as fodder for opinion. They call it opinion entrepreneurship, right? Where you're just grabbing news and spinning it into opinion and manipulating it, and then trying to draw an audience. And the reality is, if they can draw an audience and make money, they'll keep doing it. So I think it's important to distinguish between the news reporting, which in the main is really still quite good and quite reliable, and the opinion production that really is undermining our faith in news, and faith in government, faith in science, all of that.
We are discussing the proliferation of so-called fake news. My guest is an associate professor at the BGSU School of Media and Communication, Rick Busselle. Once upon a time in broadcasting, we were mandated to tell both sides of an issue because of the fairness doctrine, which we no longer have, and I believe a result was the rise of so many opinionated broadcasters such as Rush Limbaugh.
I agree completely. The fairness doctrine was negated, I suppose, in I think 87, maybe 88. And the argument the government made, or the FCC made, for relaxing it or essentially eliminating it, was that there are a lot of news outlets out there, and so it's no longer necessary for a single news outlet to represent the other side of a story, or the alternative opinion, or whatever that may be. They said you can turn to another news source for that if you want. The problem, I mean, and that's true. And I don't know that the fairness doctrine would work today, given that the argument that there are only a limited number of outlets And so those outlets have to present both sides of the story. I don't think that would work today because the argument just doesn't make sense. There are so many outlets and so many opportunities. The problem was, and you're right, Rush Limbaugh was the poster child. He suddenly could jump on AM radio for 2, 3, 4 hours at a crack and just present both only one side of an issue, but also a lot of false information and a lot of just anti-government information, a lot of anti-civil society arguments. And there was really no way to counter that because people just inherently aren't going to go look for another version of reality. They like that version of reality. And that was a huge revenue generator. And it's that kind of programming still is. It doesn't do us any good, but it certainly makes a lot of money.
The allegation is that much of the media flies as soon as they hear something without taking the time to really dig behind the headline.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know about that. I mean, on the one, it's certainly the 24-hour news cycle and the demand for profitability. Those two factors have led to fewer people producing more news content. And that means that they don't have the time to do the kind of reporting that they used to be able to do. And I think that's true, especially that's true in local news. I mean, it's when I left, I worked in Toledo, and when I left, we had, I don't know, I want to say 14 reporters, and each reporter produced maybe one big story a day and maybe one short story. And today they have half as many reporters, and they're producing 4 or 5 stories a day. And there's just no way they can do that the kind of research that they need to really do a thorough story. I don't know that they're wrong very often. I think it's just the story is just not very, very thoroughly researched. You do an interview, somebody says this is the case, and you accept it at face value and report that they said that. I think that's certainly part of the problem. I think the bigger problem is just people not distinguishing between information and opinion, and not being critical about what they're hearing or what they're being told. I've been doing a little research in deception, and it turns out that we're amazingly gullible, because we don't suspect that people are lying to us, because most of the time people don't lie to us. So we sort of evolve to believe what people tell us, which makes sense, right? I mean, if most of the time people are telling the truth, you don't want to spend a lot of energy suspecting that they're not, and you don't necessarily want to spend a lot of energy accusing, because there's no function in it. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily the case with news. I think we are suspicious of what people are telling us, but it's only when it's the quote other side, right? We're not suspicious of what our own side is telling us. At any rate, I think that if we could get news consumers to really ask 2 questions, and that is, one, does this correspond to the reality that I see elsewhere? That is, elsewhere outside of this network's reporting or this station's reporting. I mean, if what this person is saying isn't consistent with what the CDC is reporting, that should raise flags, because you're getting 2 versions of reality, and then you ask yourself, well, which one is more reliable, the scientists or the Yahoo on the website? The other is, does the story in itself make sense? So, oftentimes, I mean, it's easy enough to say, well, wait a minute, if that's true, then this really can't necessarily be true, can it? I mean, both of those things can't be true within the same story. And I don't think you see much of that in mainstream news, but you certainly see a lot of that on Yahoo websites, not Yahoo, the company, but on websites. You see, it's like, well, but if that's the case, then that really can't be the case. And people need to be more analytical about what they're consuming in that sense, I think.
I think one of the problems is that social media or many of the naysayers work very, very hard at tearing away the credibility of our credible sources. And
right.
that I think raises the issue as to how do we take a step back after we've seen something or read something and really analyze it.
We will into pretty much traditional mainstream news. I mean, we'll read the Christian Science Monitor, we'll listen to National Public Radio. I mean, they're probably a little bit left, but they're pretty mainstream. But then even on those outlets, CNN's is really a good example. You go, okay, there's the reporter at the Pentagon or whatever. And then you go, okay, that's the story. And then now we're going to do an hour of interpretation. And the reality is they just kind of repeat a little bit of spin that really we don't necessarily, as a consumer, we don't need. And by the end of the day, when my wife says, you want to watch a news show, which is about as middle of the road and mainstream as you can find, I often will say, really, they're going to talk about what we heard about this morning, and they're going to rehash it. And I don't know that there's much harm in consuming that kind of opinion or that kind of analysis that's really does its best to stay right down the middle of the road. I mean, public television could not really be any more cautious in that regard. But you can do far right or spin you far left, and we're only remembering somebody's opinion or somebody's statement. And I just don't know that that's that healthy for any meant that people would watch reruns of, Friends or whatever, instead of to think, I don't know, if you've seen the news today or you've read the news today, I don't know that you need to sit through 2 hours in one way or the other, riles us up and makes us angry with each other. That's just not helping.
Rick Busselle is an associate professor in the School of Media and Communication at BGSU. I'm London Mitchell, inviting you to join us again next week. Staying in contact.